Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Psych Muñiz.
All right, this is the seventh lecture, the seventh podcast in section 7A. We've been here forever, but this is the last podcast that we're going to be talking about. I feel like I should not phrase it that way. Of 7A, this is the last podcast. And so this is pretty exciting. We're going to be moving out of the toughest section. I always tell students, like when you're going through the AAMC outline, after you get through 7A, you're over halfway done, right? Like 7A, like just getting through that is a huge portion. And so I know there are 12 sections in the outline. And like when you get through 7A, you're like, that's like the fourth one. And so it seems like, oh my gosh, we're only like a third. Like, no, we're over half. The first ones are by far the most complex. And so after this point, it's all downhill. It's all easy, piece of cake. Okay, I don't know if that's specifically true, but a lot of the stuff later on is things like peer pressure. And like, I had a lecture on peer pressure when I was in 6th grade. And so like, I feel like I've figured it out by this point. But this is going to be the last group of psychological disorders that we're going to talk about, which is like a little bit sad because they're so interesting, all of them. But we are also ending with a very interesting field of the personality disorders, which is the dissociative disorders. And so some really interesting things here. And I know we talked about in the past, like some disorders had to be renamed, especially with like the somatic symptom disorders and the related stuff there. Because they just kind of picked up meaning in the real world. And I feel like the depersonalization, there's definitely some things kind of going on there that's like renaming things because depictions in movies and different things. So one thing with the dissociative disorders is most of them tend to stem from some form of trauma, some form of like psychological trauma where your brain, in a way to protect itself, dissociates and tries to create some distance between like the event and your psyche. And so it's a lot of these disorders are based in like a defense mechanism as a way for your like psychological self to protect itself. So the first one that we're going to talk about under this is the depersonalization or derealization. And this is always like one of the ones that's kind of like a little bit tricky to talk about. But like imagine you were playing a video game and your character got struck by lightning. Like you wouldn't feel like you got struck by lightning, right? Like just this person I'm controlling is getting struck by lightning. If you have depersonalization, that's kind of what that feels like, right? It's like, so you don't feel like, yes, I'm controlling me, but like, it doesn't feel like it's really me, or so there's some distance there. And you can see how that would be like a helpful defense mechanism if you were like abused or beaten or raped or something like that. And that's where like a lot of these come from some very traumatic event. And so you can feel like, oh, it's not really me, right? This person that I am isn't really me. And so you kind of get this like almost like a third person perspective where you can kind of like zoom out. And so that's what's going on with this depersonalization is it feels like it's not me. And that's, kind of creating some distance there. Derealization is kind of similar, but it's not just like this person isn't really me. It's like this scenario isn't really real. And I think that this is something that most people who've been in some form of like really emotionally charged thing have probably felt that at some point, this feeling of like, it doesn't even feel real. Right. Like, and that like derealization doesn't necessarily have to be like coming from a negative thing. A lot of times, like if somebody wins the lottery, they're like, it doesn't feel real. Right. Like it feels this like derealization. Derealization is actually something that I have personally felt. So story time with Phil. Back in the day, my family's house burned down and like we lost like everything because we lived in the middle of like farm country. And so like there wasn't even a fire hydrant within like 10 miles because that's not how it works in the country. And so like we lost everything. And I remember like for weeks afterwards, like it didn't feel real, right? Like I just felt like there was like this weird kind of like haze and everything kind of felt like fake, and it just didn't feel like the real world. And that was a way for my brain to kind of deal with that like psychological event of like losing every possession you own, right? Like that's like that can be a very traumatic thing. And so like being able to like, your brain is like, okay, well, it's not real. Let's just pretend it's not real, and then we'll deal with it, right? And that'll help us like deal with all of the issues that are going on there. And so it's kind of an interesting thing. A lot of times these can remedy themselves, but sometimes like you might need some like counseling or something to kind of help with this, depending on, like the circumstances involved. I feel like, man, we started off real deep there. I kind of regret bringing up the fire, because like that was a long time ago, and like it's not a big deal to me, but at this point, but like at the time I was like, whoa, like how do I deal with this? I feel like we're starting off real heavy all of a sudden.
I mean, these, like you said, these are, often associated with trauma. And I think that's very fair to consider this a slightly heavier topic. It sounds like everyone was okay in that case. So I'm really glad that everyone was all right. So with these disorders, right, there is often a component of trauma. And when you mentioned depersonalization, a lot of what I think about is actually people who have out-of-body experiences in the middle of a trauma. And so, there are instances where people it's like you said, it's almost like zooming out and feeling like, this isn't really happening, or I can see it happening to me, but it just can't, it's not me. There's this disconnect between what's actually happening and the person's perception of what's happening. Like
that's super interesting with like out of body thing, because you hear about that a lot in like emergency rooms and surgeries and things like that. Like people saying they had an out of body experience. And like, to me, that sounds like, like if you go to the ER, like it's probably like there's a good chance there was something traumatic that occurred. And so like it might actually be tied to more just this depersonalization, like as this is occurring, and your body and brain's way of dealing with it is to just like, let's make this less real. We'll turn down the knob on the realness of this. And so it feels like less real. It's not really happening to you. You're just kind of like gaining this out of body experience, this like distance between yourself and the actual traumatic trauma.
Yeah. And continuing and taking a step away from some of the more acute dissociative disorders that are associated with trauma, something a little bit more. And like you said, there are instances where that can kind of remedy itself, and with counseling and with processing, it can get better. There's also something called dissociative identity disorder. And so this is one of the ones that got renamed. People will often colloquially know it as multiple personality disorder. That has a lot of stigma with it, right? We've talked a lot about how these psychiatric disorders have that stigma attached to them. So with dissociative identity disorder, people can have, and some folks with, you often hear it called DID as well. So some folks with a DID, will have different names for some of these things, but the way I've often heard it called is having alters. And so these different components and different personalities, for lack of a better word, that exist within the same person. And so, they might have someone who takes on a more protective role. They might have an alter or a person within them that takes on a more childlike role. And so they can, not at will, but they will go back and forth between these different alters and these different individuals that can present themselves in different situations. And sometimes, as one alter might present as a defense mechanism, right? And so that protective alter might come out in an instance where they feel that it's appropriate, right? And so these different alters, these different individuals will have their own personalities. They're not all going to behave the same way. They will have, they often have different names and different ages, and they don't have to correspond to the biological presentation of the person that you see in front of you, right? And so that's something that can be tough for people with DID to have other people in their life that understand that, or that can be present for that, right? They may not remember switching. They may not remember the interactions that some of their alters have had with people. And so that can be really difficult. I was a couple of weeks ago, I had a friend recommend a TV show. And so I don't know if anyone has watched Mr. Robot. So if you have not and you are interested in watching it, there might be some spoilers. So please skip ahead a minute or two. But I was watching the first episode and, we had just gone through some of this in class. And I texted my friend. I was like, does he have dissociative identity disorder? And my friend said, did you read ahead? Did you look this up online, or how'd you know? I said, well, I just recognized some of it, and I had just been learning about it in class. And so that's how I came to that conclusion, is that as I kept watching, it definitely played out a little bit more, not a little bit more, played out a lot more.
Yeah.
But there are instances where he can't remember, right, what has happened. He loses pieces of time. He couldn't recognize his sister at one point, right? And, it clearly takes its toll on the people in his life. And so I think that and I bring this up because we've talked about like social media portraying not just personality disorders, but psychiatric disorders, and very incorrectly and in extreme versions and whatnot. And so I was really curious because I noticed this within the first, few episodes. And I said, okay, I wonder how people feel about this, because I don't know, I'm not familiar with it as much. And so obviously I don't want to assume that this is the best representation because I don't know. And so I looked it up, and as I was reading, there were some comments on different social media platforms that people were saying they were actually happy to have this kind of representation. And it resonated with their experiences with dissociative identity disorder. And so I think it's really cool that we have, at least in some instances and in more recent instances, representations in the media that are more accurate than what they've been in the past. But I thought that was a really cool show, and I really wanted to bring it up. So I'm glad that I got to talk about DID.
Yeah. It's a super, super interesting thing. I think of all of these psychological disorders, this one might have like some of the most media portrayals, just period, because it's really interesting. And like I agree. Like I want to say iRobot. No, Mr. Robot is actually a pretty good representation. There's a lot of them that were kind of bad back in the day, and they called it multiple personalities. And so that's one of the reasons for the rebranding. When the DSM-5 came out, we renamed it to the DID, Dissociative Identity Disorder. But yeah, there's some really interesting things out there. I know we've talked about this in the past, and I feel like I'm like outing myself as a nerd here, which I probably shouldn't worry about because it's probably already well documented I'm a nerd. But there is a book series by Brandon Sanderson. It's very interesting because it's a fantasy novel, and so it's like magic and like weird things and creatures and stuff, and like it's that kind of classic, like almost like Tolkien, like fantasy sort of thing, and like swords and stuff like that. But something that's really interesting in the book is that there are characters depicted in the book that have the psychological disorders. And so there's this one character that has this very extreme PTSD. And it's like, I remember like reading, I'm like, wow, this is so well depicted. It's kind of strange that it's like smushed into this like fantasy novel. And there's another character who has dissociative identity disorder. And it's like really interesting because it's depicted very well, and it's like very accurate, and like it stems from this like very severe trauma that occurred. And I feel like, if I just like cut parts of the book out and then just like took and like presented to someone, like, oh, they'd be like, oh, this is just like this seems like a real case, right? And so there are some like growing, like increased depictions of those just kind of overall. And I think the depictions are getting better, but you can see how this is kind of related to that depersonalization. And so I kind of, in my mind, think of it as just like a more severe version of that, where like, rather than like, this isn't really happening to me, like eventually your brain is going to be like, well, it kind of did. And so like a way you can have this defense is saying like, no, it happened to somebody else, right? There's somebody else in here, and like it happened to them. And so you kind of like split into these alters, these like alter selves. And so like you can say like, oh, it happened to them, and this person, their innocence is maybe maintained. And so you have this way to kind of like protect yourself by saying it didn't happen to me, it happened to somebody else. And like, okay, that someone else is still here, but you can kind of like switch between these as a as a way to have this occur. I think there was a movie. It was actually like a once again, a kind of a weird thing. There was a movie called Split a couple of years ago. That was like a horror movie. And it was kind of interesting, but there was like somebody with these like dissociative identity disorder. I keep wanting to say multiple personalities because it's so ingrained into media. But like these different personalities were very different. And once again, this one's, man, I'm like really coming across as a nerd. This one also had some like extreme, like maybe kind of like magical something kind of going on in it. But because one of the alters actually was a little bit different and like could like climb walls and stuff and things like that. But like they're actually like the way it was depicted was like, oh, that's actually a pretty good depiction of like dissociative identity disorders. And so it's kind of interesting how that all kind of like fits together.
Yeah, the name of the movie sounds familiar. I don't think I watched it, especially because I can't do horror.
Yeah,
it's just not it.
So
I can't.
No, I'm totally the same. I actually haven't seen it. I just have like heard some people talk about it, and like it's kind of this weird thing where like it's actually in the same world as the movie Unbreakable with Bruce Willis like a long time ago, and then there was like they like were in the same world, but they wasn't clear until there was a new movie that like brought it all together, and it's like, oh, these people are interacting with each other now. But super interesting. And I saw like that movie and I'm like, oh, okay. And then like maybe do some research on Split. Not that I want to watch it because it's spooky. But kind of an interesting thing. Now, something that you mentioned in there with the dissociative identity disorder is this like this forgetting of stuff. And this is also like there's something kind of related to that with this other disorder. So there's depersonalization and derealization, there's dissociative identity disorder, and then there's dissociative amnesia. And so this is a little bit different than like what you're depicting, like, you know, switching between personalities and like losing some memory of like whenever you're in the other one or vice versa. Dissociative amnesia it's more just like this traumatic event occurred and your brain just represses that. And so it's gone. Like you just forgot it, right? Like it no longer exists. And this is once again a way to kind of deal with that, right? Is to just suppress and make that just kind of go away. A lot of times students get confused between dissociative amnesia and regular amnesia, like retrograde and anterograde amnesia. And so retrograde amnesia is when you forget the past, anterograde is when you can't make new memories. Dissociative amnesia is when you forget very specific things because of how traumatic they were. And so like it's a way to kind of like do this. So in a way it's kind of like a retrograde amnesia because it's like forgetting stuff in your past, but it's much more specific, right? And it's like pulling of certain things. There's also a thing kind of related to this as well as a dissociative fugue or a fugue state, which is when very often in a fugue state somebody will act differently. They'll kind of like change the way they act and do stuff. And then they'll have this big period of time that they've just forgotten, right? Like it's just kind of like disappeared, right? And so it isn't always, but very often like combined with this like altered behavior. But there is some interesting things kind of with this. And once again, you know, to go into media mode, because like I feel like all the dissociative disorders are so interesting. A lot of times they're used in media as like an interesting thing overall. I feel like this is like the fourth media thing we've mentioned in just like a couple of minutes. But there's a TV show most of you have probably heard of called Breaking Bad. So in Breaking Bad, spoilers, he's not a great guy. He makes meth. I don't feel like that's spoilers. That's like first two episodes sort of thing. But at some point he like disappears. And I can't remember if it's like, you know, something with like some cartel or like he has to go make like a whole bunch of meth or something. And he like disappears for like a week and his family doesn't know that he's doing this. And so like he has to like go and do this for a week. And then he's like, how do I come back? Right? Like I can't, like, what do I do? Like what are my wife and my kids, like, what are they going to say? Like, if I just like show up and they're like, hey guys, like, how do you play that off? And so, in the also spoilers, he has cancer in the show. That's also episode 1. So I don't feel like that's too like crazy of spoilers. And so he's on like cancer meds and he has cancer. And so he decides to fake a dissociative fugue. So it's not a real dissociative fugue, but he's faking it. And so what he does is like after the week is up, he just like takes off all his clothes and walks into like a grocery store and he's like acting really confused and strange. And they take him to like the hospital and they're like, where have you been? He's like, I don't remember. Like I went to work on Monday. What day is it? And he's like just like faking a dissociative fugue. And I think that's one of the only times, like the only good examples of a fugue I've seen in media. And it was like a faked one, but hopefully that kind of like helps you understand what this dissociative fugue is, and this dissociative amnesia, where you've just kind of like forgotten in something.
Yeah. And I kind of want to point out that this dissociative fugue, you'll also see it in things like PTSD, right? Since you brought up PTSD in the novel that
right.
You read. So these, right, this is kind of what we were talking about with it being associated with trauma very often. And so individuals who experience these really severe traumatic events, and I guess severe and traumatic are, yeah. So they can often forget pieces of those episodes, or if it's ongoing trauma, they might only remember some of the events and not all of them. And that's the brain's way of saying, I need to deal with this. I have to be able to, do something. And so that, that coping mechanism, that defense mechanism, that was the word I was looking for, can be, forgetting and amnesia. And so I guess with the I meant dissociative amnesia in PTSD, right. Not as much the dissociative fugue. Although
I think that's something just kind of with all of the dissociative disorders is it's some form of defense of just like this thing happened. How do you deal with it? Like you pretend it wasn't real, or it wasn't you, or it was somebody else who was living inside you, or you just forget it and repress it. And so all of these are just different ways of dealing with this traumatic event. There are differences between them. And so you do need to be able to like pull those apart in case you get a question on test day. You need to know the difference between like a fugue and just like dissociative amnesia or depersonalization or derealization or dissociative identity disorder. And so you want to be able to like pull all of those apart. But some of the like the causes, the root of them is very similar in most cases. So these are just different ways of dealing with that.
Yeah. And as we kind of wrap up the disorders themselves before we hit the last point of 7A and the psych disorders. So it's really easy to look at, sorry, my Play-Doh's like in my hand. So it's really easy to, think and hear these disorders and say, wow, like they obviously impact a person's life. Is it possible to have a quote unquote normal life or to be successful or be able to do things with these disorders? And, I think both Phil and myself have shared some relation to these different psych disorders. And I like full disclosure, I'm very transparent with my life and my like MCAT journey and med school journey and all of that. Like I currently hold more than one of these. And it's very possible to be able to do things that you want to do with, psych disorders, and they don't have to stop you from living the life that you want to have. And so if you've gone through these and, you've listened to our podcast and you have that concern, or, I've had students in the past who have really severe anxiety and they're like, I don't know if I can even sit down for the MCAT. Like, I don't know what I'm going to do on test day, or, students who have had panic attacks on test day, things like that. It doesn't mean that you can't be a doctor. It doesn't mean that you can't change someone's life. And even if, you decide, I know people in my life who were interested in medical school and then they changed their mind. Right. And so, that doesn't mean that you can't have an impact or that you can't do amazing things. And I think reminding yourself of that is really important. And I think that there's a lot of, I think even within the stigma to not disclose these things because of the impact that they might have on other people's perception of you and whatnot, and the way that people treat you. But it's and not saying that, people have to go out and disclose everything to everyone, but it's very possible to do what you want to do in life, even with a psych disorder.
Yeah, we've been talking about personality disorders for a while. And I think that like, if nothing else, just realizing how common they are. I know like at the very beginning of this, talking about like 25% of people in any given year, 25% of Americans will experience a psychological disorder. and that will, like, it's not the same people every year. And so like things can change. Obviously some of them are. And so like the odds that like you're going to be affected or people you care about are going to be affected by something at some point is like really high. Like it would be strange if it didn't happen, right? That would be unlikely. And so just kind of being aware of these things, and understanding them a little bit better. Obviously, tons of stigma with these things, but just kind of understanding that you're not alone if you're dealing with some of these things. And just like, literally today is something that I talked about that I dealt with was like the derealization stuff. And there's all sorts of interesting things that kind of go into that. But that, I guess, wraps up all the actual psychological disorders that we were going to talk about, which is kind of interesting, exciting. Like there is an end.
Yeah, it's a little wild. But before you get too excited that this video is ending, we're not quite there yet. So you'll also notice if you look at the 7A outline that there is also a section on biological bases of some of these disorders. And so that's what we are going to wrap up this video with and truly wrap up 7A with. And so to get us started, we'll talk about schizophrenia. So and note that these are blurbs on these will be a lot shorter because you're just not going to be tested as much on these. And what you need to know is a lot more limited. But with schizophrenia, I think we talked about this before, that it has a genetic component to it. It's also, so what's interesting is that it's also associated with traumatic births. And it's also associated with, and again, these are very loose associations. And what we know about marijuana is fairly limited in the grand scheme of things, but with also like gestational use and family history can have a really big component or having to do with
factor,
schizophrenia.
right.
Yeah. And so what's interesting is that there are a couple of, dopamine, you're going to hear us talk about dopamine quite a bit for this last bit. But with schizophrenia, it's often considered an overactivity of dopamine and an inhibition in the function of glutamate. So you have this overactivity and a lack of inhibition in terms of on the neurotransmitter level. And so if you remember, part of the treatment for schizophrenia is actually antipsychotics, right? And such a poorly named group of medications. But with those, they're going to block the dopamine receptors, right? They're going to decrease that dopamine release. And so that's how they're going to impact schizophrenia. And so I think we've also mentioned this before. A lot of what we know about these disorders and how they work is actually with medications and knowing what the medications do and the response that they have on patients with these different psych disorders. So with schizophrenia, dopamine, too high. Right. And glutamate, not enough. So you have increased signaling and not enough inhibition.
Yeah. I feel like schizophrenia is, I have some feelings about schizophrenia that I talked about earlier, and that it's like really, it's way more complex. What's going on with schizophrenia with all the different subtypes and ways that it can present. The dopamine stuff and glutamate stuff is the like typical. I don't know if I want to say like typical schizophrenia, but there are other versions that don't seem to respond and have anything to do with dopamine, maybe. And so it's a little bit trickier. So don't think that it's just like, this is an automatic fix, because sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it makes things worse. And like, you got to be like, okay, well, maybe something else is involved. Maybe there's something going on with serotonin or like the actual structure of the wiring of the brain or things like that. And so, especially schizophrenia, I feel like is a little bit of a mess in terms of trying to diagnose and treat, because there's so many different ways that it presents, and there's so many different ways that it can respond to treatment. And so that's one that I think is a little bit trickier overall.
Yeah. And I think we've mentioned this before. It wouldn't be surprising if in the future, right, in the future versions of the DSM, there are different, like they're no longer lumped together. Right. And so maybe, there something gets teased out and we understand more about them. And, we start classifying based off of treatment or how things respond. But that's a really great point. Even with other disorders, people can have, different people can have the same disorder and respond differently to medications. And so that's why psychiatrists will often trial medications. If it's not working, then they switch to something else. Yeah.
And that's why, as you mentioned, that's how we understand this is like somebody is suffering from schizophrenia. We give them something that increases dopamine and like, ooh, that didn't help. We give them something that decreases dopamine, like, oh, that seemed to help. And so like, that's really really like kind of where a lot of this diagnosing comes from, especially schizophrenia is a little bit tricky. And as you mentioned, like I think there's a decent chance that our understanding of it will only increase. And I imagine that eventually, you know, when you guys are graduating and practicing, you're going to be like, okay, well, everything that they were talking about, that's changed, especially for schizophrenia. Some of these other ones we understand a whole lot better. For example, dopamine, or not dopamine, depression. Everything's about dopamine. So depression is, as we mentioned, one of the most common. It is the most common psychological disorder. And there's some strong, like talking about the biological basis of this, there's some strong relations with serotonin and not enough serotonin. And we know this because we can give selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which basically when you release serotonin, generally you like absorb it back into the neurons. And so if we stop that reuptake, that means we release the serotonin, we just leave it out there a little bit more. And so the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, basically increase the amount of serotonin overall. And that has had some very good effects and very good outcomes with treating that. There's also some stuff maybe going on with dopamine as well. You know, dopamine has this like reward pathway. And so like whenever, you know, people who suffer from depression very often have this anhedonia where they don't feel joy and don't feel reward for doing things that typically would make them feel like joy and like rewards, like a rewarding experience. And so there may also be some stuff going on with dopamine, like maybe not enough dopamine in certain areas. But I think like primarily if you're going to relate it to a neurotransmitter, probably think serotonin as like the main thing, but there is some interrelationship with dopamine there.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting with depression is that it's probably one of the ones that we, in a sense, understand the most, but is also that helps us realize how complex all of these disorders are. Because, you know, like you mentioned, depression, we most classically associate it with, you know, low levels of serotonin, also low levels of dopamine, also low levels of norepinephrine, you know, HPA, stress axis, hyperactivity, overactivity, and increased glucocorticoid. Like there's so much tied in with it. And that's just talking about the biological bases, right? I think we talked about with depression, also social components. And, you know, there are so many other factors that play into it. And that I think is a very clear, like other psych disorders probably have really similarly complex pathways that affect them. And so that's something to keep in mind and I think the one phrase that might be useful to remember some of these neurotransmitters is the monoamine hypothesis. I can't speak. So that hypothesis. And so that ties in like norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. And so just kind of continuing, actually, before I forget, so bipolar disorder, and I don't think this was something that we had initially thought about, but bipolar disorder is also affected by serotonin and norepinephrine. And I think with that one, we usually consider it higher levels, but it's also heritable. And I think it was worth mentioning that before we forget to mention it.
Yeah.
So we also have Alzheimer's in terms of what we're talking about. And so
I love that sentence. We also have Alzheimer's.
I probably should have flipped the order of that sentence.
Right.
So we are also talking about Alzheimer's. And so you didn't really hear us talk about it in terms of the psych disorders, because it's generally considered more of neurological than psychiatric. And so, but you do
those aren't the same thing. And I think a lot of times people get confused, like Parkinson's, we also want to talk about now, but like it's not really a psychological thing. That's more of a controlling your body movement thing. And so psychological is just about how you experience the world. So it's a little bit different.
You would see a neurologist for these next two conditions.
Yeah.
And so Alzheimer's is a neurodegenerative process. And so if I'm not mistaken, it's actually the number one cause of dementia. And so it's fairly common in that regard. And so it does have a genetic component. I'm tripping over my own words. It does have a genetic component with the APOE gene. And so really the thing to know is that genetic component. And so you have this brain atrophy, you have this degeneration, but you also have a drop in acetylcholine levels. And so it's really easy to forget that acetylcholine is not just the end neurotransmitter for muscle movement, but it's also involved at the level of the brain, right? And so you have this decrease in acetylcholine, you have these beta amyloid plaques, and you'll also hear tau proteins mentioned with respect to Alzheimer's. There's memory loss, there's, confusion, there can even be personality changes. And so really thinking if you remember nothing else with Alzheimer's, what you're most likely to see on test day, aside from that dementia, confusion, and memory loss, is going to be those beta amyloid plaques. And you don't have to know the specifics of how that's impacting each of those, but you do have to remember that constellation and those general aspects of Alzheimer's.
Yeah. I also I know you mentioned this, but just like a decrease in acetylcholine is also indicated. And a lot of this stuff, even with Alzheimer's, it's pretty well studied. Like we study it a lot, but I still think that there's a lot of room for better understanding. There are some genetic components that mean you're a little bit more likely to get Alzheimer's. It doesn't mean you're guaranteed, but there's some interesting things going on there. And so as we that's another thing that I think that there's going to be a whole lot more to say about it in the future. And so, that's a great thing. That means we're going to understand it better and hopefully have better treatments. It is kind of interesting. Alzheimer's, you mentioned it as a neurodegenerative thing. The brain actually gets smaller, it degenerates and shrinks. And something that's kind of interesting, a lot of times people don't get diagnosed until they've lost 30% of their brain mass. And that's a lot, right? That's a third. And so note that Alzheimer's, generally when it starts, there's not a lot of symptoms, and your brain with its adaptability is able to try to compensate and try to figure out and make things work until it reaches some critical point where all of a sudden we're having some severe cognitive issues, which is where the dementia comes in.
Yeah. And another reason why it's, often diagnosed a little later is because there's also some normal aging, right? That people, as we get older, we start forgetting some things. And, we all have an older family member who's I can never remember where I put my keys. I don't know what I had something I wanted to say and I don't quite remember what it was, but that's very different, right? Than forgetting, who you're talking to and not recognizing who you're talking to, losing some of those older memories, having periods where you just don't know what's going on. And so it's really easy for family members to say, oh, they're just forgetting, they're getting older, right? And so it can be really hard at first to distinguish what is the onset of dementia and Alzheimer's, or what's the onset of Alzheimer's, and then what's a normal, just aging. A normal aging.
Yeah. Yeah. That's something that's very interesting there, is just kind of drawing that line and where you're able to. One other thing that I kind of want to mention with Alzheimer's overall, and now I feel like an idiot because I've forgotten what I was going to say. I started that sentence and I'm wording through. I'm where was I going with Alzheimer's? Maybe I actually have. Let's play it off like I'm pretending I have Alzheimer's at this point. I've actually so this is a good proof that just because you forget stuff doesn't mean you have Alzheimer's. There are some interesting things with the genetic component, actually. Just a fun, interesting thing. I don't know, fun, interesting, but there's certain genetic indicators that mean you're more likely to develop Alzheimer's, as I mentioned. And there was actually, I think this occurred while I was in med school. They made it illegal for, if you get your genes tested, you get your DNA sequence, you send it away to one of the companies that tells you about all the indicators of stuff. They couldn't tell you that you were more likely to get Alzheimer's. They made that illegal to say, because so many people would see that as that means I'm going to get Alzheimer's. And it's not it doesn't mean that. It just slightly increases your odds, but most people aren't going to get Alzheimer's. So even if it increases just a little bit, it increases slightly, that doesn't mean that you're going to get it. And there was a lot of worry about telling a bunch of people they were going to get Alzheimer's. What are the effects of that? And that's not really what the data was saying. And so those companies can tell you what genes you have, but they can't interpret the genes, like what they mean specifically for the Alzheimer's ones. And so it's like a really interesting, like legal thing kind of going on with the Alzheimer's stuff, which is just a little bit strange.
Were you kind of alluding to like companies like 23andMe where they,
like
I remember that there was a change in that. And it was, I think a few years ago, like you said.
And it was like a thing where they could still tell you whether you had this gene or not, but they couldn't say that means you're going to be more likely to get Alzheimer's. Like a law passed that like it made it illegal to actually say that.
Yeah. And attached, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go for it.
So attached to that, throwing in some bio in here, right? You know, you can have mutations and you can pass down mutations that don't necessarily mean you will develop the presentation or the disorder. And so you can have variable penetrance, right? Mm-hmm. whether having the gene means that you will have the disorder or not.
Yeah, that's a bio term there. Variable penetrance of the genes. Yeah. There's also some like really interesting indications. I care a lot about Alzheimer's because it's one of the things that I focused on a lot for my research. And also like my mom was a nurse. And so growing up every day, I would go to the retirement home in my town and I would just like hang out with the old people till my mom got off work at 5. And I did this like every day for like 7 years. And so like seeing Alzheimer's, eventually going into research with Alzheimer's, it's one of those things that is like a little bit scary, right? Like it's one of those, I think of the disorders that makes me like a little bit worried and scared. It's up there for me because like, losing a leg is one thing, losing who you are is something a little bit stranger. And so, and there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with Alzheimer's. I feel like I could talk for like a decade just about like some cool stuff, but there's also a lot of correlational studies that show that if you stay mentally engaged and that you give your brain tasks and like stay mentally active, it actually will slow or prevent the onset of Alzheimer's. And so like doing lots of puzzles, like it just seems like the people who do those things are more likely or are less likely to develop Alzheimer's than people who like, let's say their job is like a monotonous thing where it's like, they're just like doing the same thing every day and they're not solving new problems and they're not doing things. And there's some things like travel and like experiencing new things in your brain, trying to deal with all of this that maybe indicates like there's some environmental component to this. And that I feel like that's why most of the psychological disorders are so hard to study, because how your brain works is also very much related to like what it's doing. And that's environmental stuff, but also there's genetic components. And so there's a whole lot more going on than just pure genetics. Although genetics do seem to have some interplay in there at some point. I also remembered the thing that I was going to say, which is dementia. So I talk about this with students all the time. So I can't remember if we've talked about it in the podcast. I don't think we have, but most people, when they think dementia, they just think about forgetting stuff. Dementia means a cognitive loss, right? And so that doesn't mean memory necessarily. Yeah, if memory gets worse, that is a cognitive loss, but so is like losing the ability to do math or like having trouble like speaking or controlling your movements in like coordinated ways. Like those are technically dementia. But because Alzheimer's is the number one cause of dementia and like the number one thing that we notice with Alzheimer's is loss of memory and recognition, a lot of times people think like dementia means memory loss. And like that's not exactly what it is. Now, memory loss is the most common type of dementia, but dementia is a bigger thing with just loss of cognitive capabilities overall. So you have something to say on that? Super interesting.
No. Okay. I'll let you wrap us up.
Okay. So the last disorder that we're going to talk about here, as I kind of indicated, is Parkinson's disease. And we're not talking about, like, once again, it's not really a psychological disorder, because this is more about like how you control your body. And so talking about specific neurotransmitters, like once again, dopamine seems to play a role in this. But I actually think that more than just like general neurotransmitters, I think especially for Parkinson's, you also want to have an idea of like the region of the brain which is the substantia nigra, which is this darker region of your brain that's kind of substantial. So it's called the substantial nigra, which means substantial in black. And so like this darker area, and like this controls a lot of movement. And so there's, I think most people are familiar with Parkinson's disease probably through Michael J. Fox, who is, Back to the Future and all that stuff. And he has Parkinson's, and he's since been in some like TV shows and like things just kind of like talking about Parkinson's and playing a character who has Parkinson's because he does. And so I think a lot of times people are pretty familiar with the presentation of it, but this like loss of coordination and these like tremors that occur, especially when you're not trying to do something just with like at rest, like tremors, it's probably like the easiest like visible symptom of Parkinson's.
Yeah. So these folks have a loss of dopamine, right? And so that's one of the, not one of, but the mainstay treatment is basically giving them dopamine. So they get L-Dopa. And there are also some, what I think are really great new possibilities. So like deep brain stimulation and whatnot. But this decrease in dopamine, like you were saying, in that loss in the substantia nigra, are going to lead to, right, those resting tremors. They're also going to lead to slower movements. They're going to lead to, and what's interesting is we say these slower movements, right? There's also, though, in terms of their walk and their gait, they have sometimes this gait. So there's the shuffling gait, right? But there's also sometimes they'll start a little bit slower and then they'll start taking lots of little steps. And that's really characteristic. And so oftentimes the gait will play a big role in being able to diagnose someone with Parkinson's. There are also other things on the physical exam, which we don't need to get into, that are helpful in diagnosing it. And I think something that's interesting about this, and that is, I think, worth noting, because we've been talking about possible treatments and whatnot. And I think this will, someone out there maybe listening to this will help us figure out how to deal with this problem. But it's possible to actually cause, when you're treating Parkinson's, to cause additional symptoms and actually, in a sense, worsen the Parkinson's with long-term treatment, because you're basically just throwing as much dopamine as you can at the body in a way that works for people. And so that's why it's really important that we find, alternative forms of treatment, because it's not just tremors. It's not just, having trouble, like walking and bringing things to yourself. These individuals can eventually reach a point where they can no longer feed themselves and where they actually can't even eat. Right. And so it becomes a very, in other disorders, it can deteriorate quite a bit. And so hopefully someone listening to this podcast will be able to find, new ways to address some of the psych disorders that we have talked about, some of these neurological disorders that we just brought up here, because I think there's so much work to be done. Mm-hmm. And as much as we all want to do something about all of these, feasibly we can't, right? I can't sit here and become an expert on the psych disorders and neuro disorders and, all these other things, same as with people listening, but hopefully we all find something that we're interested in. And whether, we make a difference in talking to people and getting awareness out there, or we go into research, or we go into clinical practice, there's always something to do.
There's just a lot of mysteries just involved in all of the psych stuff, especially some of them we understand a little bit better than other. Parkinson's, depression, we understand the causes a lot better. But there could definitely be better treatments. Other things, we don't necessarily understand the causes all that well, like a lot of the personality disorders or schizophrenia. And so it is really exciting to be working in a field where there's still things to be done. There's still things to discover and explore. And that's why I very much leaned towards the neuro realm, because there's a lot of question marks still in there, a lot of things to be filled in. And so I love that idea that maybe the people that we're talking to who are listening, one day they're going to figure something out, because that is entirely possible.
Mm-hmm. And I think I speak for both of us in that, that's part of why we do what we do, to help you guys be able to go on and do great things. We enjoy seeing you guys succeed on the MCAT, knowing that you're getting into medical school, all of that brings us genuine, and again, I think it's fair to speak for both of us in that regard. But yeah, that's something that, that's why we do this podcast, right? That's why we do what we do. So thank you guys for joining us on this wild 7 episode journey. We are excited to wrap this up and continue with you all on the rest of the Psych Outline.
Yeah. So it turns out there is more. 7A is not the end, but we have crested the hump. We've gotten past the psych disorders. So we're going to start talking about the way that we interact with the world around us and the why we act and behavioral stuff. Still super interesting. It's not, like the psych disorders where some of them are like, wait, what? There's a disease that makes you do this? Like, that's strange. But there's still a whole lot of stuff to talk about, and I'm pretty excited to do a deep dive on some of these things coming down the line.